I'm Carmine Gallo with Marc Randolph. He is the co-founder of Netflix and author of the new book, That Will Never Work. Great title. We'll get to that in a minute. Marc, thanks for inviting us to Santa Cruz, California, where the idea for Netflix all began.
It's a pleasure. Welcome to Ground Zero.
This is Ground Zero. I want to talk about that. I want to talk about origin stories, startup mythology. Storytelling is something that I look at everything through the lens of storytelling. The year is 1997. You and Reed Hastings worked together in a company in Silicon Valley. So you would drive from Santa Cruz to Silicon Valley every day along with Reed, and you would turn to him and pitch ideas. From what I understand, he would shoot down a lot of those ideas, except for one. There was one idea that really caught on, and that became sort of the initial inspiration for Netflix. Let's look at this in two different areas. Let's look at we'll talk about the longer story, the more complex story, but I'd like you to at least relay the origin story, that one short, concise story that has become Silicon Valley legend.
Well, it's great that you're kind of asking for the two versions here, because it is this truth that when someone says, where did this idea come from, and you launch into this 10-minute version, you can see their eyes glazing over. Mm-hmm. So pretty quickly, Reed and I kind of narrowed in on the apocryphal story that it came from a late fee on a movie, that Reed had a $40 late fee on Apollo 13, I guess it was, and boom, instantaneously the idea for Netflix was born.
I love the story on so many different levels, and the fact that the story has something very specific too, but not too many specifics. A $40 late fee, which sounds outrageous. There's a specific name to the movie. In your book, you write that the story itself is beautiful. You say it's useful, it's emotionally true, but it's not the whole story. What's the difference?
Well, the thing is that ideas and companies have a very complicated patrimony. It is not just one person with this idea fully formed, like Newton under the apple tree or something. There's a lot of contributors. Yes, one person may have had a late fee, but someone else may have spent a whole career in direct marketing. Someone else understands subscriptions. Someone else knows algorithms. But it's when you combine all those things that these ideas come forth that become a company. But as we've said, it's a mouthful. And so you want something which is emotionally true. You want people to all have an aligned compass. You want them all to be able to make independent decisions about, is this right for the company or wrong for the company? You want the customers to know, would Netflix do that? And having these simple emotional stories is hugely helpful. And the Apollo 13 is perfect. It understands in one sentence, this is a company about making video rental work better. And that's a pretty powerful emotional brand for a company.
I thought it was interesting in the book because you say very specifically that the $40 late fee kind of served as a debate point, a talking point, but it's not the whole story. And yet, it's a good, true, useful story. You say, is it a lie? No. He did get dinged $40 for a late fee. But you said it's a story.
Yes.
And it's a fantastic story. And then you go on to say, and this I think is critical for everybody to understand, that narrative is useful for startup entrepreneurs and early stage companies. Why?
I'm trying to get people aligned. I want to give people a reason to come to work and understand, what are we trying to accomplish here? And if it's something vacuous, like it's all about getting to an IPO, who wants to go to work for that? But if you can, in a nutshell, make people feel they're making people's lives better, they're making it easier for them to see the entertainment they want to see, they understand what the purpose is. And I think that's the narrative that I'm trying to get. And it works for customers too. They immediately understand these things.
Reed uses that story quite a bit.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, when you want someone to understand what goes into really building a company, when I want an entrepreneur to understand that it is not just boom, done, perfectly formed, well then you write a book. And then you have 350 pages to tell that story. But a lot of the times, $40 late fee can be useful.
Speaking of the stories in your 300-page book, the one story that seems to be getting the most attention, and I have to admit I love it too, is the story of Blockbuster. The year is 2000, a year and a half or 2 years after you and Reed launched the company. Netflix was doing $5 million a year in revenue. Blockbuster, get this, was $6 billion a year in revenue. You and Reed decide that you have to partner with Blockbuster. You make a pitch. You actually visit Blockbuster headquarters. You make a pitch for them to acquire you. You would take over their e-commerce site. They would focus on their thousands of stores. Take us into that pitch room. What happened next?
So there was a number of things that were crazy about this circumstance. I mean, the big one was that we were at a corporate retreat, so neither Reed nor I had anything but resort wear. And all of a sudden we find ourselves in Dallas, Texas, in this 27th-story glass and steel skyscraper in this massive conference room, in our shorts and our flip-flops.
And they're all buttoned up.
And of course the Blockbuster folks come in and buttoned up. So you can almost visually understand this tiny little gnat of a startup and the big successful, somewhat stodgy corporate enterprise. And it set this up from the beginning that way. And this was also the year 2000, as you mentioned, which was the very, very end of the dot-com bubble collapsing. So a dot-com company, I mean, how pathetic is that? And of course, when we pitched them for $50 million to buy our startup, they thought it was ludicrous. I mean, they all but laughed at us. And it's a really interesting story to tell, not just because of the vividness of this conflict between the tiny company and the big one, but because it says two different things to two different audiences. Because what it tells someone who's in a startup, it says, wow, anything is possible. That even a company who is deeply in debt, at the very end of the dot-com bubble collapse, with no experience in video, can eventually prevail over the $6 billion category leader. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting that for the people who work in a large company, there's a very different message. Because for them it says that your size and your dominance is not forever, that you're vulnerable.
You use that story quite a bit in your keynotes, and people in interviews that I've seen about your book like to hear that story. It's a delicious story on so many levels, and it is a David and Goliath story. Stories never get old, by the way. We've talked about this. Stories don't get old. They just kind of take on a different form.
Well, there is something, as we both know, about how storytelling can make people feel certain ways. They touch certain nerves, and that story does. People see themselves in it. They cast themselves into different characters depending on their circumstance.
Mark, tell me how this skill to be a good writer, this is one of the better business books that I've read since Shoe Dog. It reads like a novel. It's very good. How did you get to be such a good writer and also a public speaker? You think through the type of stories that you're going to tell and what they mean for those audiences. Where did that come from?
So Netflix wasn't my first startup. It was my sixth startup.
Yeah, people should all know that. So it's not always a success.
I've had a lot of experience bringing people into these apparently impossible tasks and rallying them to keep charging into the breach over and over and over again. So after a while, it almost becomes a requirement that you have the ability to motivate people, to have them believe, to have them feel. And so I've been practicing, you might say this, for 40 years at being a good speaker. And the same thing goes for writing. As a marketing person, I've been writing, and writing persuasively, again, for my entire career. And so what you realize is there's different forms, that for a book, wow, that's a different form. And so I then had to pair the other piece of my personality, which is total geek, about learning something I don't know anything about, like writing a book. And the same thing for the keynote speaking that I do. It's realizing that I have an hour, or I have 45 minutes, or I have in a TED Talk 15 minutes, and I've got to get some points across, but more importantly, I've got to make people feel. I've got to align their compass in a certain way. And that's a fascinating and bottomless skill.
For someone like yourself who has studied public speaking, writing, making people feel through story, what is the role that public speaking and communication skills play in the life of an early stage startup or any entrepreneur who's watching or reading this? Because now you mentor entrepreneurs, you invest with entrepreneurs and startups. What are we going to tell them? What is the message about public speaking and communication skills?
In a startup, you have grossly too few resources. You have 6 people to do the work of 60. And these people then need to work independently. You do not have time to give them the manual, to say, here's exactly the steps you can take. All you can do is be clear about where we're going, what constitutes success, what their role in this is, and turn them loose. And I have not learned any better way to do that than by speaking to them, either one-on-one, as a group. Again, I keep using this term, I want to align the compass. I want them to be gone for 3 weeks and have an unerring sense of what this company needs me to do. And that comes from speaking.
Well, if you've read Shoe Dog, you have to read That Will Never Work, because it's a great compliment to any entrepreneur's bookshelf. Marc, thanks for writing it. And thank you for Netflix, by the way.
Oh, you're very
it's
welcome.
Changed the way my family consumes entertainment, so thank you for that.
Well, thank you in some small way helping get my kids through college. So appreciate that too.
Thank you, Marc.